Welcome to the Fancy Comma YouTube. I am joined by Tom McIver, who is an anthropologist and writer who wrote a chronology of the life of Seckel, who McIver knew personally in the mid-1980s. Seckel died in 2015 as a friend of Jeffrey Epstein and in-law of Ghislaine Maxwell. Check out McIver's chronology, which I'll link in the description box. Recently, I also wrote about Seckel's involvement in cleaning up Epstein's digital media presence post-Epstein's jail time via mentions of science philanthropy to crowd out all the news about Epstein's crimes. Welcome, Dr. McIver. So tell me, how did you know Seckel, and you said you knew him personally?
Yes, I began to work with him when he started a group called the Southern California Skeptics, which met mostly at Caltech. It was a regional affiliate of the National Skeptics Organization. I went to the lectures and got to hear a lot of prominent scientists. Seckel would host these meetings as head of this Southern California Skeptics group. So I worked with him and got to know him personally, and I began to find out that he was unethical and dishonest. So it was disillusioning, but I kept up with the group because I thought it was for a good purpose, and I wanted to be part of that movement. But it just became intolerable for me to continue working with him. And I sent a letter of criticism to some of the leaders of the National Skeptics movement who I'd corresponded with in the past. And some of them were not interested in hearing criticisms. They preferred to continue backing him. Some just didn't want to get involved. And some said they privately agreed with me, but couldn't do anything. So at that point, Seckel found out about my criticisms and he threatened to sue me. This was back in the late 80s. By then, after this legal threat, I began to look into him further because this was becoming more and more obvious that he was outright dishonest. And I discovered that he didn't even have the credentials he claimed. He claimed to be a graduate in both math and science from Cornell and to be currently a grad student at Caltech. Neither of these were true. I contacted the Cornell office, and at first they couldn't give me any personal information because he had contacted them himself to thwart inquiries and had his records sealed. So I wrote to the registrar, told him he was making these false claims, and the registrar told me, well, in view of this, yes, I can tell you he didn't graduate. In fact, didn't even come close to graduation. He flunked out after just a couple of semesters. And Caltech, the same story. I contacted their registrar's office, and they said they had no record of him, but he was continuing to make claims about being at Caltech. He had befriended a number of scientists at Caltech who allowed him to use their lab for his email addresses, and he would just simply say that he was a researcher at Caltech.
Do you know who he knew at Caltech?
Christoph Koch, a neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscience, who was a friend of his, and also Shin Shimojo, who was a visual scientist. In Shimojo's case, I think Seckel just kind of pulled the wool over his eyes. He was maybe just naive about Seckel. Koch's case, I'm not sure. But these two people he continued to use there to say he was a research fellow or a researcher at both the Koch and Shimojo labs at Caltech.
Noticed that because I saw his website. I looked it up on the Wayback Machine. He had a Caltech website. It was like caltech.edu. That's Caltech's domain. And then it was like, it had the way it was written, it looked like he was an investigator, but then if you went to it, at least in 1998, it was like his LLC. And he actually spoke at the MIT Media Lab. Thanks to your chronology, I discovered that he visited MIT when I was a student there and gave a talk at the Media Lab. And they said he was affiliated with Caltech on the invitation, which you found on the Wayback Machine and linked it. And I posted a screenshot on my blog that I wrote. And even though he had no degrees, he didn't have any degrees, I don't think.
Right, he didn't have any degrees. What he would do was say he was a researcher at Caltech. He would put out posters to events such as you're talking about at the MIT Media Lab, and they would say, Professor McIver-Seckel of Caltech, and it would show the Caltech logo, and he's describing himself as professor. I mean, of course, you assume that he's a faculty member or some such at Caltech. People just believed him. I mean, it's astounding that somebody can fake something so seemingly so easy to check as their credentials. But this is what he did. Now, I know in many cases there were lots of newspaper and magazine articles about him because he loved to talk to reporters. He was just a super self-promoter. He would tell the reporters that he was a Caltech grad student or faculty member or whatever, and they would then write that in their articles.
You mentioned an LA Times article, and where it says I think it said he graduated. It says he graduated from Cornell in physics and math and took
Yeah,
leave from Caltech, where he was a candidate for PhDs in both at Caltech, both astrophysics and biochemistry. I didn't know. I don't think you can even do that.
he told the reporter then printed it, but when he sued me many years later, I mean, because I said that he claimed false credentials, he would say, "No, I didn't say that myself. The reporter said that. It wasn't me." This was a standard excuse of his. Sometimes he would tell people directly, but most of the time he was careful not to say it directly himself. On one occasion, I heard him lecture. He had a series at the Santa Monica newspaper. It's now defunct, but he persuaded them to let him be a columnist about pseudoscience and various things. And he gave lectures sponsored by the newspaper. I attended one of these lectures. He was introduced by the editor as, again, these credentials that are false. I went to the editor later and said, "Where did you get that information?" She said she was going to introduce him herself, but he pulled her aside just before the talk and said, "No, introduce me with this instead," and gave her a written statement which contained these false claims. But again, it was her that said it, not him, so he could claim that he was not lying. I mean,
It's pretty arrogant to just walk up to someone and be like, "Hey, that's not my real credentials. Here's my real." It also doesn't make sense in a way. Like when you think about what it really takes to be a Caltech PhD and stuff, and just like how easy it was for him to just pretend to be one. Because I know, okay, we have like, I went to MIT and it kind of has a bit of a rivalry with Caltech. But one
yes,
thing that MIT has is it also kind of has like what I would call like, well, we don't really have like groupies, but we have like people that don't go to MIT, but they hang out with MIT people, so they get like socialized with the MIT people. So they might
yes,
do mystery hunt or all the cool things like role playing games or whatever we have going on. I know mystery hunt, which I participate in. It's like a puzzle solving competition. I think we've had Caltech people join us sometimes. But yeah, does Caltech have like groupies of that? Like, do you think that Al Seckel was like a Caltech groupie and he kind of just pretended to be, or do you think he really wanted to be a scientist? Because he does talk about being a cognitive neuroscientist like later on.
he did want to be a scientist, but he couldn't hack it, he couldn't study, he couldn't pass tests, he couldn't do the academic work, but he read books. He liked to hang around with scientists, and he hung around at Caltech when he got there, and he would treat the scientists he was trying to befriend. He'd take them on camping trips, and he took them on whitewater rafting trips, and that's how he got some favors in return, such as use of their lab. So he definitely would pal around with them. Now, he could speak the science. He was very good at kind of imitating and just parroting back. He claimed that he was part of these special study groups with Richard Feynman. He claimed to be one of Richard Feynman's grad students and a member of a group of 3 or 4 people that would meet almost every day with Feynman to discuss the top issues in physics. I mean, he did know these people. He did befriend Feynman for a while, so there's a grain of truth in this, but I know in Feynman's case, Feynman found out soon enough that Seckel was a charlatan and dropped him, but then Feynman died soon after, so Seckel was able to continue making these claims about his friendship with Feynman without being contradicted. Gell-Mann continued to befriend him for quite a while, and it took a lot of evidence before Gell-Mann finally admitted that this was not the person he claimed to be. He was just really good at telling people what they wanted to hear, I suppose.
What do you think about how easy it was for him to befriend these scientists without any real degrees?
He could give them some favors, such as these camping trips and vacations. Sometimes he'd take them on vacations with him. Don't really know, because I've heard some people who've met him for the first time and said that they could immediately tell he was a fraud, just from the moment he opened his mouth, that he didn't know what he was talking about, that he wasn't expert in the things he claimed to be expert about, and they didn't believe him for a second. But obviously there were many people who did believe him, including many scientists you'd think would know better. It's not totally clear to me how he was able to persuade them.
Were they involved in this, like Christoph Koch, or I don't know how to say his last name?
Yeah.
What kind of, do you know anything about the relationship of Christoph Koch and Seckel?
I did write to Koch at
Or
one
Koch,
point,
yeah.
or however his name is pronounced, fairly early in his relationship with Seckel, and said, listen, this guy doesn't have the credentials he's claimed, and I just want to let you know, in case you weren't aware of this, and that you should know who you're associating with. And he sort of brushed me off. I can't remember it, but it was just a kind of dismissive reply. And then I found out later that he simply told Seckel that I'd contacted him, and Seckel must have made some excuses and told Koch how evil I was and just out to get him, some vindictive campaign of personal hatred or jealousy or something, and for Koch not to believe anything I said, and Koch apparently preferred to believe Seckel. Shimojo, when I contacted him, the other fellow whose lab Seckel used, was more accommodating. He said, well, thank you for this, and he eventually realized that this was not a good person to be associating with. But for a long time, Seckel was claiming to be co-authoring a book to be published by MIT Press, which would be the definitive textbook, the scientific explanation of visual illusions. And it would be Seckel and Shimojo co-authoring this. This was not true. He just somehow talked Shimojo into having some role in Shimojo's writings or something, and just spun this into a claim of this textbook that was just a false claim. People don't check these things.
So he never wrote that textbook with the Caltech professor with MIT
No,
Press.
because he didn't have the qualifications to be a co-author with Shimojo.
That's interesting to me because Seckel, what I learned about him in the Epstein files is that he kind of talks about himself like he's a scientist. So I was like, oh, he's a scientist. But then I Googled him and he's like a writer and he studied optical illusions. And according to what you wrote, he had a children's column about optical illusions at some point. And he described himself as like the world's foremost expert on optical illusions, which I feel like you can be an expert in optical illusions. But then he said he was a cognitive neuroscientist, and I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, at least by training. It takes a lot cognitive neuroscience to have it as your job, especially to work at Caltech. There's some really, I would say, well-known cognitive neuroscientists at Caltech, and I mean at MIT as well, where I studied, and it's pretty hard to actually be a cognitive neuroscientist. Like the schooling, you have to have some degrees. You have to know the literature. You have to be able to do research and like publish research. And as far as I can tell, Seckel didn't do any of those things. Which is like fine, because like science does have a very gatekeepy aspect of like, yeah, you have to go to school for like 5 or 6 years, then get your PhD, then do your postdoc and like whatever. But it's also interesting to me because I feel like Seckel had the same thing going on with him that Jeffrey Epstein did, in a way where like Jeffrey Epstein also had no science degrees.
Yes.
I think he did work as a physics teacher and
a math teacher.
But he dabbled in research. I don't know if Seckel dabbled. I mean, it sounds like he did as well, but I feel like just that alone really like that kind of like gives them like a bonding experience. And it's interesting to me that they were able to befriend these scientists. It's very hard to actually work in their labs. There's so many people that want to work there, but the fact that he was able to like get a domain from, I mean, I don't know how much that means that you got a Caltech domain. There are people that have MIT domains, like maybe their friend sponsored their account or something, so they can have like at mit.edu address. But I don't know of anyone that did that for like clout necessarily, because usually we would know that like that person is not a real professor. They're just the kind of groupie of science.
Yeah, he was interested in illusions and he collected many and he got people to give him some or make some for him and he claimed credit for all of these. When he started publishing these books, these were largely not all children's books, but they were not scientific textbooks. They were books of illusions, and they included some great illusions, but they were not illusions that he created. They were not illusions that he researched. He would give some explanations of them, but they were often explanations that he just stolen from other people, that he got that other people wrote for him or he just plagiarized from other people. Some of his explanations were not good, but he parlayed this into claiming that he was this big expert on illusions, and that was how he got to lecture at prominent universities all over the world as the greatest expert on visual illusions, as he styled himself, just because he had collected many illusions from various people. And he was like Jeffrey Epstein very much in they like to collect people. They like to hang around. They both dreamt of assembling people and being the impresario who oversaw these meetings and conferences of scientific minds that would be transformative. And his Mindshift conference that was in 2011 when he was working directly with Jeffrey Epstein. This had been a dream of Epstein to get the best people on his island. He'd done some conferences like that in the past, but he wanted to do more and better. And I think he and Seckel were both kind of jealous of each other's network of famous scientists. They both wanted to exploit the other's scientific networks. And so when Seckel found out that Epstein dreamed of having a super conference like this, he jumped in and said, "Oh, I can do that. I know all these people. I can assemble the greatest group ever for you. Here are some names. Let me get those if you'll sponsor this and pay for it." And Epstein was intrigued and did sponsor it and pay for it. That was Mindshift in 2011 on Epstein's private island as well as other locations. And then Epstein didn't like the results, which was odd too. It was kind of a odd relationship. Epstein thought that the conference was a flop, that they didn't come up with any breakthroughs as far as ideas or inventions or creative scientific thoughts. It was just kind of a social gathering with entertainment and just sort of gossip. It's because Seckel could bring these people together, but he just expected that bringing them together was all he needed to do. That magic would then ensue just by having them all together in the same place. He didn't plan any workshops, any events, any research questions really. So nothing happened much scientifically or intellectually.
I looked into the Mindshift conference, and there are some names I recognize. One of them was actually a woman named Frances Arnold, who is a professor at
Yeah.
Caltech. And actually, she emails Jeffrey Epstein, and I want to say she emails him through Al Seckel, and it's like, "Hey, can you hook me up with this Epstein fellow? Do you remember that in the Epstein files?"
I remember that Frances Arnold was a participant in the conference, and I don't know if Seckel had known her prior, but most of these people, I guess all of the people at the conference were friends of Seckel's or were known to Seckel, I think. And some of them were actually Paul Kirkus, for instance, was actually a childhood friend, a friend since childhood. They'd gone to high school together. So this is definitely Seckel's group more than Epstein's group. Brock Pierce was another interesting candidate. He was the former child actor who got heavily involved, still is involved with Bitcoin, and is a strange character himself, not a scientist in any sense. This is part of Seckel's selling point, that he got people together from different disciplines to try to expand the creativity. So he wasn't claiming that they were all hard scientists, but it was a strange group, and definitely Seckel's choice as far as most of these people.
Francis Arnold emailed Al Seckel in 2010 and said, "Hi, Al. I wanted to ask if your friend Epstein got back to you. It was a lot of fun to talk to him, and I could tell he knows quite a bit about topics that are interesting to me. Here's Francis, sent from BlackBerry." Back in the day when we had BlackBerry.
That was just after the conference then, it sounds like.
The conference itself was in 2011, January, so this was in June 2010. Maybe I can share my screen on here.
Okay, so she had heard about Epstein and was hoping to get connected to him.
Yeah, so this is my, I don't know if you can see this. This is my blog.
She had spoken to him. Okay, Catherine Moore was another scientist who was at the conference, who was very close to Seckel personally, and to Isabel Maxwell. Frances Arnold, I think it sounds like she was just hoping for support. I mean, some of these scientists had understandable motivations of just getting financial support from Epstein. Some of them were excited by the possibility of joining these circles of not only other famous scientists, but people in entertainment, entrepreneurial world, just kind of the social thrill. But I think Epstein's fortune and philanthropy was a big motivation for a lot of these scientists. I can understand that.
The lack of funding, especially now, it feels like scientists are so easily bribable because there's so little funding. I think the stats on grants that are being fulfilled is like pretty bad right now. But it was worse. It was better back then. But yeah, a lot of the Epstein files, there's a lot of people just emailing Jeffrey Epstein, because I think that somewhere in academia they realized they can just email Jeffrey Epstein and his foundation and ask for money, and it's like relatively easy to get money from him. And the MIT Media Lab, where back when Seckel spoke at the Media Lab and when I was an undergraduate in 2004, Jeffrey Epstein was involved with, there's a lot of like him being involved in Harvard, which is also in Cambridge, the other University of Cambridge. But I think a lot of his involvement with the Media Lab was in 2011, when he was just diverting checks from other institutions and just sending them all to the Media Lab and exchanging emails with the head of it, Joy Ito, who was like, had all these ideas, supporting the undergraduate Bitcoin club, hosting a residential school at the Media Lab for like K through 12 students. I forget what grades exactly, but like these really bizarre ideas. Sometimes asking Jeffrey Epstein, like he asked Jeffrey Epstein, should I use some of this money to support the undergraduate Bitcoin club? And Jeffrey Epstein just wrote back and said, like, yes.
And Seckel was a personal friend of Joy Ito. I don't know when that started, but in fact, his picture on the Wikipedia entry for Al Seckel is a picture that Joy Ito took from his friendship with Seckel. And yes, Epstein had admiration for Harvard. I think he gave a lot of money to people who would tell him they wanted to do research in areas that Epstein, was interested in personally. So that's a possible danger of this kind of philanthropy, that it's not just need-based giving, but it's giving to people who are aligned with your agenda.
Getting money from Jeffrey Epstein was often as simple as just like emailing him and him being like, yeah, sure, like here's my accountant. He's just constantly sending people money.
Yes, Seckel himself claimed to be a philanthropist. He wasn't. In that way, he's very different than Epstein. But he dreamed of being able to support and oversee projects and money distribution the way Epstein did. Seckel was always desperate for money and always had many schemes going at the same time to try to get money by fraud because he didn't have any, but he nevertheless claimed to be a philanthropist. It was just part of his image of himself, part of his fantasy depiction of himself. He wanted to be like Epstein in that sense.
He was very much in the Epstein circle. How did he get involved with Epstein? Was it when he married Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, or?
Yeah, it's. I think there's some overlap in interest. He had become a member of the regulars at these elite conferences, like the TED Talks and the World Economic Forum talks at Davos, and a lot of other really prestige international conference organizations, and that just became much of his life. He would just jet around to a different conference and just hold forth on what an expert he was, and just pal around with these other prestigious scientists and conference attendees. And he probably met both Ghislaine and Epstein himself through some of these conferences. I think the EDGE conferences that John Brockman hosted, both Seckel and Epstein were members. I don't know if they met personally there, but he met Ghislaine, I think, at some TED conferences perhaps, and he married her in 2007. So that was the year he sued me also. So this was shortly before Epstein was convicted in his so-called sweetheart, where he served a month in a year or so in prison in Florida. And it was on his release in 2009 that Seckel began communicating with him in earnest and proposed to whitewash his online reputation, and did a lot of work in that respect. He didn't do the work himself. He just got people who could scrub online reputations, and he just kind of supervised that. But also, it's when he discovered that he went to Epstein's Island because of the Mindshift conference. I think Isabel Maxwell was there too. I think he also took his daughter, Elizabeth, there.
There's some really interesting connections between the Maxwell, I think it was Ghislaine Maxwell. There was like a party for this Nobel Prize winner. She was on the guest list of attending this party to celebrate this Nobel Prize winner. Both Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein both were involved with science, as was Al Seckel. So I'm wondering, this isn't related to Al Seckel, but I'm wondering, why do you think it was so easy for not only Jeffrey Epstein, but also Al Seckel to basically like break into these like scientist groups?
I know you're mentioning this overlap. I know Ghislaine and Isabel, her sister, who Seckel married, and Seckel himself both created, over the course of some years, various foundations which had to do with saving the world's ecology and oceans particularly. And these were framed in terms of sort of grand philanthropic ideals. And I think those were made to appeal to scientists, to show that these were people who were out to save the world and give them respectability.
It's definitely a thing in marketing, I know, because I work in marketing, and you always want to make people feel like they can trust you by having like what's called, I read this article about like trust signals, like having a picture of yourself on your website signals trust, like you're not a random robot that will just take their money and run, which actually is funny because they both are kind of famous for doing that now and like defrauding people. And I guess maybe Al Seckel did that. Jeffrey Epstein also had a similar thing where he would like, I think I read this in the New York Times, he would like not be honest about his financial transactions with people. or something like that. I don't remember the details of it anymore.
Yeah, Epstein's finances are very murky, and I don't pretend to know anything about it. I don't think anybody really has a real clear picture about it. Seckel was, as you said, I mean, he really did just snare people in schemes and take their money and run, unless they were powerful people who could help him, in which case he didn't steal their money. But everyone else, if he could get away with it, he did, but he just got people to trust him. He could always point to all his scientific friends. Listen, I know so and so, this whole list of prominent scientists, and they all will vouch for me. They will attest to me. So how can you not trust me? I mean, again, you'd think it would be easy to contact some of these people because some of them would not have vouched for him. I mean, he just claimed that they were his friends, but in fact they would just be acquaintances. Some really were his friends and would support him, but who's gonna check the whole list? Some of these he loved to claim that scientists who were deceased were among his best friends, and that's something you can't check as far as personal recommendations. But yes, gaining trust is I just think Seckel was sociopathic and just really knew how to give the signals to indicate you can trust me. He just knew how to fake them really well. And I think he often started to believe his own lies. I mean, he would seem really outraged at some of the criticisms of him, even such obvious ones as faking his credentials. He would say, how can you even suggest this about me? I spent so much time at Caltech, went through all of this to gain the trust of people there, and I had to go through all of these rigorous requirements to get them to allow me to use their labs and such. How can you dare claim that I'm not a true Caltech researcher? I mean, he seemed to truly believe that he was.
Do you think he did that because he liked science, or do you think that he just wanted something else and that academia, apparently just Caltech and all these other fancy places gave him that?
That's interesting. I think he did like scientists. He wanted to be part of that world desperately. Uh, this was the only way he could do it, by just becoming an impresario of scientists and a collector and a networker. Another thing, I mean, he was famous for his parties and his entertaining. He would just invite dozens of really prominent people to these lavish events at his house. And his houses, he would just rent these mansions, these really luxurious places that were incredible spots to entertain people. He didn't have the money in real life. He would just skip out on the rent or whatever, but he would always be living in these fantastic places, host these amazing get-togethers with all kinds of people, largely scientists. And he'd say, Murray Gell-Mann will be there, and McCready will be there, and Catherine Moore will be there, whoever. I mean, he'd drop all of these names, and who wouldn't want to go to parties like this? And he said there'll be Hollywood people there and some movie stars you might recognize, and people in the business world, and some billionaires. And these events just became very well known, and everybody wanted to go to Seckel's parties because of the people he'd assembled there. And that was his entry into this world.
Is it just, well, I was going to say maybe it's a SoCal thing because SoCal is so much more like fancy than basically anywhere. But then the same thing also happened in, basically you could say it happened in Boston area with Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, Boston is also a place of prestige and power, especially among academia. But I looked up a picture of Seckel, and he doesn't look like his appearance is not that of some. He doesn't seem like, when I look at his picture, and maybe that's a bit judgy, but I don't. He's
I
kind
think
of,
I know what you're talking about. He definitely doesn't look like somebody who has charisma. He
yeah.
doesn't he doesn't look like somebody who has a magnetic personality. That is obviously not the draw with him. He had to rely on externals, on the people he knew and the achievements he claimed for himself. Those pictures of him that you're referring to, I mean, they're truthful. He did look like that, and those were his best pictures. I mean, he definitely chose the ones he thought flattered him the most. He was very conscious of his appearance. So no, he just does not. It's not personal magnetism. It's certainly not charisma in the ordinary sense. Southern California did have the Hollywood and entertainment appeal as well, and he hooked into that. He would always have sprinklings of actresses and models, fashionable people, and people in the glitzy entrepreneurial world too. I think so. There was a little bit of an advantage over Boston in that respect, but people just loved to go to his get-togethers. That was just the way to be seen, the way to meet people. It must have had a special appeal to scientists who, other than a few scientists who are well known popularly and known to the public, most scientists are only known to their own circle and within their own specialties. And to be wooed by somebody like Seckel, who's promising to introduce them to colleagues like themselves, but also many people who are well known to the public, I think it had quite an appeal.
Seckel actually sued you, and I forget, he kind of threatened, I read your chronology, he kind of threatened to sue you over the years. And you said he finally sued you in 2007 when he was marrying Isabel
Yes.
Maxwell. As an now investigative journalist, I've heard that it's very easy to be sued. Anyone can sue
Yes.
anyone for
Yes.
anything. And so what was it like to constantly, I'm assuming you constantly got letters from him, and well, you do have some of your letters in the chronology where like he's like emailed you and like stop saying that I registered my nonprofit and it was actually for profit because the nonprofit part like lapsed or something, and like all of this different stuff. So what was that about, and how did you get out of that lawsuit, or whatever happened
He
with that?
initially threatened me way back in the Southern California skeptics years in the mid 1980s. And that was when I was just criticizing him for being unethical and dishonest. I hadn't yet found out about his phony credentials or his financial fraud, but he was just obviously afraid that I would come across these things if I continued to examine him. He just wanted to shut me up from criticizing him. And it wasn't until 2006 that he again told me he was going to sue me, and that was because of his Wikipedia entry. He wrote his own Wikipedia entry. He didn't just edit his entry, he just wrote it from scratch. There was no Al Seckel entry. He thought that as this great scientist, he should have a Wikipedia entry, so he wrote one about himself, and it's just a study in kind of wishful thinking and self-promotion. He's careful not to make any outright lies, but it's just a sheer self-written puff piece and self-promotion. That was in 2006, and a few weeks later, I stumbled across it and contacted Wikipedia and said, listen, he wrote this himself. It's dishonest and self-promoting. You don't allow that. Shouldn't you delete it? And if he needs an entry, just have somebody write one objectively, not him himself. And I didn't get the response I expected. It was kind of hostile. They said, no, he's obviously so wonderful and deserves an entry. And if you don't like it, just edit it. Just change the things. So I did so just very discreetly. In fact, what I did, it's funny, I just quoted one of the Los Angeles Times articles giving his credentials as a source for his credentials, and that would be considered by Wikipedia as a reliable source. Seckel obviously didn't want me to do that because that was a lie, so he complained that I entered this Los Angeles Times article as a source about his credentials because he didn't want people to look into his credentials. So it's kind of a almost comic episode. Here I am referencing an article that praises him lavishly, and he threatens to sue me about it. He actually did sue me, but not until almost a year later, because he wanted to wait until I wouldn't have had time for the year time limit to countersue him. So in 2007, he actually sued me. But this was when he was working on these really big fraud schemes that eventually brought him down, eventually caused him to flee to France. But he was very desperate that his name not be sullied publicly while he was working on these big multi-million dollar frauds. So he was very desperate to silence me. What he did with the settlement, I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement because it just costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend yourself in a lawsuit like that if someone has that kind of money to sue you. And I was being represented for free by my insurance company, but they didn't want to continue, so they just said settle. And I did, and had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and that was sort of a victory for him because he thought he'd silence me, but I just continued to try to contact reporters anyway and just continued to follow him. And then when I saw his connection with Epstein in 2011, I just went kind of full throttle in trying to expose him then.
That must have been really stressful getting sued by this person and then seeing that they're in the Epstein file. What was that like? Was it like, oh, this makes sense? Or it was like, oh, wow, this is worse than I ever imagined?
When I saw the Epstein websites in 2011, I was really shocked, and it was really threw me for a loop because here he was being supported. I didn't know who Epstein was at the time, but I immediately began researching him, found out how rich he was and powerful, and my heart just sank because I saw here he is Seckel is being supported by this guy who has all the resources in the world, and obviously he's in very tight with him. But on the other hand, I had also found out that he was being sued because of this major fraud scheme that was developing at the same time. So I didn't have any compunction about trying to alert people to this because he was still obviously engaged in fraud. So I just thought it was in the public interest to try to reveal this. Being sued by people who have that kind of money. Now, another almost comic aspect of this is it turns out that Seckel didn't pay hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to sue me because he doesn't really have that kind of money. Or if he does have that kind of money, he uses it on other things, luring people into his network and entertaining and whatnot. He just conned his own lawyers. He just paid them retainer fees to get them on board, and then just had them go through this year and a half of extremely expensive litigation against me, and he just didn't pay them, or didn't pay them in full. So if you got that kind of hubris, I mean, if you're a con man of that audacity, you can get away with quite a lot. And he did get away with quite a lot for his whole life until the very end.
He was high school age when he applied to Cornell
Yes.
and didn't get in, and then got in provisionally, and then it's on your website. He applied for Cornell. He got rejected.
Yes, his friend Paul Kirkus that he took to this Mindshift conference told me by telephone that he got rejected by Cornell, but he just called up Cornell and convinced them to let him in provisionally, and then he started flunking out almost immediately. But again, just the chutzpah, audacity of that kind of a con.
I think the weird part to me is that he didn't really do well in Cornell. He ends up getting he's rejected, then he attends again in the fall as a special student, and then he doesn't go to Cornell anymore. But then he just lies to people and tells them that he has all these degrees. And they believe him, and they don't fact check it, which is like, that's part of the problem too.
Right. He spent the whole 4 years at Cornell pretending to continue being a student, and he befriended especially this professor, Pierce Williams, historian of science, who had an amazing private library of rare scientific books. And that's where he got interested in rare book sales and other antiques. And that was one of his money-making schemes. Again, one which he used to defraud people mostly, but something that started back in his Cornell days. And I think he told his parents, I don't even think he told his parents that he flunked out. I think they just kept sending him money for college and he accepted it.
So did he just show up at Cornell every day for 4 years and was like, I'm a student here?
Well, he'd tell people later that he was such a brilliant and special student at Cornell that's why they don't have a record of him, because he was off the charts, literally. But again, I mean, some people will believe the most outrageous lies if they think you're convincing. I mean, he married, his first wife was a true, genuine Cornell graduate. I expect she knew, or who knows. And Pierce Williams.
Yeah, Cornell 79, 70, his ex-wife at Cornell 79.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. It makes me wonder, like, why was he like that? Do you know anything about his childhood?
Kirkus is somebody who I'd love would just open up about his childhood life with Seckel. He has told me some interesting anecdotes by telephone, but his mother was a rather well-known pianist and composer who'd actually fled Nazi Germany and was taken up at Yale by Paul Hindemith, the famous composer, and she became respected in music. And his father was an artist, and so Seckel grew up in this art and music loving household. But he didn't have any talent in those fields. He saw science as his way to fame and respectability.
How long did it take you to put together this website? Because I tried to read it in one afternoon and I couldn't. It just has way too much stuff.
It's incredibly long, and because I started it when he sued me, I started to kind of keep track of the events in order to defend myself against the claims he was making and to support my own contentions. Then, after I started finding out more about him, I started adding to it, and I put it online. I think maybe about the time after his association with Epstein, but I've just been adding to it. That's part of the reason also why it's stylistically inconsistent. I added a lot of text from the Epstein files simply because they were available and easily transferable. So it's very wordy in recording some of his communications with Epstein.
That was really useful because I have been searching the Epstein files, but the Epstein files, you can only search specific keywords because it doesn't have advanced search. So you could search for like Al Seckel or whatever, if Al is short for something. I think he just is Al Seckel in the Epstein files, but he has a lot of emails in there.
They're not in any kind of order and stuff. Yeah. So it took me a long time just to try to sort those out and arrange them and get the gist of what was going on those years, but quite revealing.
It really gives you like a new perspective about his role in the Epstein files because he also was someone that hid stuff, actively deceived people. Like I feel like he made it his life's work to just like be a completely different person to people than he really was. And that's really interesting to me.
Deception, illusion. I mean, that was both his claimed expertise and description of himself. I mean, he was a elusive character and great at deceiving.
Yeah, him and Epstein both. Epstein was also interested in deception. He wanted to have a conference on his private island about deception, and he corralled all these famous scientists. I applied to graduate school at Harvard, and I corresponded with several people that are in the Epstein files. And I got rejected from Harvard grad psychology program, and I emailed the Harvard psychology department. I was like, why didn't I get into this? And they forwarded my email to Joshua Green, who's actually a morality researcher that did an Edge Foundation conference called Morality is the New Black. I had Mark Hauser as well, but they had to withdraw from the conference because of scientific misconduct. And so I have this email from him in my inbox about why I didn't get in. And it was like something to do with the fact that the spots are very competitive. And then there's another guy in the Epstein files that is named Stephen Koslin.
He's very interesting because, again, it's an almost comic episode, a rather extended episode, because Seckel, for a long time, was claiming to be an associate of Koslin's and working with Koslin's lab colleagues or working at Koslin's lab or something. I forgot how he worded it, but basically he was claiming to be a lab associate of Koslin's. I think it was because this was when Coslin started being supported by Epstein. Coslin was one of Epstein's researchers, and Seckel was starting to associate with Epstein himself, so he figured, oh, Coslin and me, we're both Epstein scientists, so I can claim to be a colleague of Epstein. And in fact, he had contacted one of Coslin's lab members or something, and they spoke about something or other, but he was never in Coslin's lab. He was never associated. So I wrote to Coslin way back then and said, Seckel is claiming to be in your lab or working with your lab. Do you know this? Is this true? He wrote back and said, I've never heard of Seckel. Who is he? He shouldn't be claiming this. And this went on. Seckel kept claiming it, so I would write to Coslin again saying Seckel is still claiming this. And Coslin would write back and saying, well, no, I've still never heard of him. I found out through the Epstein files that I guess Seckel complained about me to Epstein, and Epstein asked him, listen, Coslin contacted me and told me about this dispute, and he said he didn't want you claiming to be working with him, but Seckel tried to make it up to Coslin and say, this guy, I've spoken to one of your lab people and I'm sorry for this misunderstanding, but don't pay any attention to this crazy guy, McIver, who's been stalking me and is telling all these outrageous lies about me. But Coslin was one of Epstein's scientists, very definitely.
He's in the birthday book, I
Okay.
think. And actually, well, he's very involved with Epstein. So much so that in 2000, I forget the exact year, but around the time I was applying to jobs, I was like visiting Harvard and stuff. Stephen Coslin was the chair of the psychology department at Harvard, and he made Epstein a visiting fellow or
Yeah.
something. So basically, like a grad student type figure. In the news, some reporting said that he didn't really do much, but I feel like it sends a statement
Yes.
about
Yeah. Yeah.
Harvard psychology to have Jeffrey Epstein be a researcher. And I think Jeffrey Epstein made fun of that himself. Like he was like, oh, look at that. And like he would just like kind of like make fun of all the people that were calling him out on all the stuff he was doing. Cause he kind of like evaded the law in so many different ways over the years. And he could just make fun of people that really took him to task on it. Stephen Coslin, I searched for him in my email, and my friend and I were both applying to graduate school back in the mid 2000s, and she wanted to apply to this program that was joint Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital, and the director of that program was Stephen Coslin. So she forwarded me Stephen Coslin's email, and she was like, hey, this program sounds cool. And then I forwarded it back to her like a couple months ago, and I was like, did you know this guy's in the Epstein files? And she was like, no, that's really weird. A lot of my friends have looked up people, and a lot of MIT Boston-y people are in the Epstein files.
Sometimes it's for innocent reasons, but
Yeah.
there is a lot to be concerned about. Coslin was certainly one who was deeply embedded, uh, and I just find it almost humorous that he and Seckel were both Epstein scientists, but they weren't communicating with each other initially. Coslin didn't know that Seckel was making these claims about being a colleague of his. And then Seckel complaining so desperately to Epstein, listen, Epstein, Coslin, it's just a misunderstanding. I really did work with Coslin's colleagues. McIver tried to exploit that and make it seem like I was being dishonest, which of course I never am. Trust me.
As a scientist, I've been talking with people I know, and many were kind of like, a lot of women in science especially are kind of like, I knew this all along. Science is so corrupt. It's such a boys' club. It's just interesting to me that both Seckel and Epstein could network with these scientists at such a high level. I mean, they did have something to offer the scientists. That was probably a huge part of it.
Epstein, they both had something to offer the scientists. Seckel didn't have the money that Epstein did, but he had the connections, and he pretended to have the money. But yes, very much a clubby thing. And I think this term, the Epstein class, is a useful way to look at it. And Seckel certainly wanted to be a member of that class and largely succeeded.
Apparently so. Well, it was good to chat with you,
Yeah.
Dr. McIver. Do you have anything else you wanted to add that you didn't mention, that we didn't talk
I
about?
don't know, some things. I mean, there's a lot of details. It's a very complex subject. I mean, there's so many aspects to this. And Seckel's had a variety of different careers, different ways of presenting himself. And the whole Epstein connection is a big topic in itself. But there's much more to Seckel than just Epstein. There's a whole matter of deception and con men, and how we can get away with that. So yeah, any questions? Just feel free.
All right, thanks. Definitely link to your chronology. It has a lot of interesting information. Thank you for your time, Dr. McIver.
Thank you. Very, 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 very welcome.